Hello and welcome to Ravlic at Large. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this particular episode, and thank you for those of you who provided some wonderful comments and looked at all the other episodes featuring the Assistant Minister Andrew Lee, Senator Barbara Pocock, and Greg Barton from Deakin University. It's been fantastic to hear your feedback along the way. The federal government, somewhere in the middle of December, tells us things about our economy, kind of like a half-year report. They call it the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. Now, my guest today is going to tell us more about some of what the MyEFO document tells us about the Australian economy as we go into 2025 and closer to a federal election. You may have heard something about some bad news about budget numbers, etc. And that doesn't mean that Jim Chalmers wants to be a Grinch. He's obligated to tell us what the state of the economy is. Now, Deloitte Access Economics director and my head of Deloitte Access Economics, Pradeep Phillip, joins me to explain what this serious document is and how we can navigate it to better understand what our economy is like. Pradeep, thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you, Tom.
Now, I occasionally kick these discussions off with a basic question and a foundational question, because not everybody comes to a discussion understanding the documents that detail the state of the Australian economy. What, in the simplest possible terms, is the mid-year economic fiscal outlook?
Sure. Tom, maybe I can explain it this way. You have a budget in Australia that's typically at the federal government level delivered in around May, and sometimes it changes at the just by a decision by the Treasurer and the Prime Minister as to exact the time. But let's focus on this. Once a year, there's a federal budget. And usually halfway through the year, there is an update on that budget. How are things looking? How are things going in terms of spending or revenue flowing into the Treasury coffers? Have the economic parameters for the year ahead started to shift? And so you get every year a budget and a mid-year update called the MyEFO, as you described. There's a third document that in this budget cycle appears every year, and that comes in around September, October, and that's the final budget outcome. This is a report that tells you for the last financial year, when all the books are finalized, what the outcome was. Now, 3 budget documents every year. And just before an election, there is a 4th document that appears called the PFO, the Pre-Election Fiscal and Economic Outlook. And that's a document, once a federal election is called, it's a document released by the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of Finance. And that tells the voting public the update on the state of the books and the economy at the time that the election is called. So 4 good budget documents. If people ever want to know how the budget's going, you go to one of these. If you want to expand your knowledge about how the world works, go have a look at the budget documents. And equally, if you want a good night's sleep, sometimes pick one of these things up.
So you're recommending them as a non-chemical cure for insomnia, are you?
Indeed.
If we
One of many uses.
If we go momentarily back to the document you mentioned that comes out in September, October, which is the actual budget. So this is where we get the 23, 24, for example, the actuals as opposed to the forecast or the budgeted numbers. So you can see the variances.
Correct.
How should people grapple with that in their thinking? Because not everybody works with numbers the same way.
Yeah. Look, and it's always a difficult task. There are the absolute numbers that you should think about. And then there's the change between a budget, a final budget outcome, or a mid-year economic and fiscal outlook that you look for. Because the change tells you a little bit about the stance of policy. The change tells you about whether some things are growing faster than we expected or slower than we expected or in line with our expectations. So it's really important to get a handle on the change between what was forecast at budget time and what is updated, for example, in the document that the Treasurer has released today. And then, of course, when, like every one of your viewers who has a business, they rule the accounts at the end of the year and they do all their final reconciliations, well, that's your final budget outcome. So it's important to look for the change, particularly since what was forecast at budget time in this particular document, the MyEFO.
In some respects, and if we can be imprecise here, and I know it's not the same thing, but one way of thinking about this is like a half-year report for a listed company, but it's not quite, is it?
It's not quite, because it also gives you updated forecasts, not only on decisions that are in the control of government, but it tells you what has been happening that are outside of the control of government. Yeah. So in the budget, you look for two things. What has shifted the numbers because there's been a deliberate policy decision that's been taken? So, for instance, since the last budget, the government has made decisions about spending more money on childcare. So you'll see that as a policy decision in the budget. Since the last budget, I think they've spent a bit more money on defense. Well, you'll see that here as a policy decision. But then there are things like, at budget time, the government would have had a forecast of unemployment. The unemployment rate midway through this year, and therefore that would flow into the amount of unemployment benefits that are paid out. Now, what we have found is that unemployment has been lower than the government had expected. There are more people in jobs than the government expected. Now, that is what they call a parameter change. And so the consequence of that is actually, because there have been more people in jobs, there's more income tax flowing into the coffers of the Australian Treasury. And so you look for policy decisions since the last budget, and you look at parameter variations since the last budget.
That's a neat point in which to segue into this little document that has come out today. What are the things that it tells us about the way in which the economy is framed or is situated at the moment?
So let's start with what does these set of budget documents and budget numbers tell us about the economy? It tells us that government spending and migration have been propping up the Australian economy. It tells us that the private sector has been really flat. Right? And it's not surprising, given increase in interest rates, global uncertainty, that the private sector is in a lot of trouble. The third thing it tells you is that the slowdown in China is already affecting Australia. There's less money coming into the Australian coffers. There's less economic activity. The price we get for the things we trade with China in particular are coming down. So we're not getting the same income flowing into Australia from China. And the last thing it tells us is that investment in this economy is the Achilles heel of our economy. So this document tells us something about the state of our economy. What does it tell us about the budget? It tells us that this gravy train of the rest of the world giving Australia a paycheck has come to a standstill. So over the last 4 budgets, Tom, on average, about $80 to $90 billion of revenue surprises flowed into the Australian Treasury's coffers. Why? Mainly because commodity prices were higher. China was effectively giving us a big paycheck. And to give the government credit, they banked a heck of a lot of that. But that gravy train has stopped. The second thing that's happened is that spending has increased. And so when you put those two things together, you start to form a picture that the revenue base of Australia isn't quite up to matching the spending that's taking place by the Australian government. And that's why you've got a fiscally unsustainable position starting to develop. And so there are things then around the state of the economy and about the budget that give us an idea of, so what should we be doing next? What should people be looking out for? What should we expect from our politicians? And we're within only a few months of going to election, Tom. What do you want the Australian economy and the Australian government to be doing for you?
Now, I think it was your budget monitor that looked at some aspects of what might be coming up in MyEVA. And one of the remarks you clearly made in there, and it's been observed elsewhere too, especially with the release of MyEVA, is that budget surpluses are nice things, but we're not going to have one for a very long time. Can you explain
That's
why?
right. So again, so you'd recall we had a string of budget deficits, particularly driven by the pandemic.
Yep.
Federal government, this government delivered 2 surpluses, by and large, because they banked revenue upsides that came from the rest of the world. And they resisted the temptation to just go and spend. So in that respect, they're a little bit unusual compared to governments we've seen in our recent past. They banked a lot of that. But then they've also spent a lot of money since then. Why? Because they came in with, in one part, an election mandate. 2, it's easy to say cut spending. It's a lot harder to do. 3rd, they've spent things in areas, for example, Tom, you recall there was a Royal Commission into aged care. And that Royal Commission said, spend money in X, Y, and Z. Improve the quality of life for people in aged care, have more nurses, pay them better, make sure they've got enough time with patients, not just doing admin, improve the quality of the food that goes into aged care. Guess what? That costs money. We've then had a change in the global landscape. Security concerns have risen significantly in the minds of people right around the world. That's necessitated, and you've seen this particularly with the AUKUS agreement, the shift towards needing to spend more money on defence and national security. Then there have been things like childcare and mental health and the NDIS that have sucked up more money. All the while, especially as you look out over the coming 4 years, the forward estimates, as it's known in budget language, you see revenue starting to come down, i.e. not grow as fast, and spending outpacing the growth in revenue. And so we see this string of deficits over the forward estimates. In this particular year that we're in, the Treasurer has forecast a deficit that was smaller than they expected. And why? Primarily because we've had lower unemployment and therefore more people in jobs and personal income tax increases flowing into the Treasury coffers. But going forward, you see expenditure growth faster than revenue growth. And so the deficits have gotten bigger.
There is a debate that's going on between the government and the opposition in relation to government spending contributing to the deficits. If, let's pretend I'm a bear with little brain for the moment, which I think some viewers will find amusing, but let's just do that for the moment. How do you explain that to people? Because on the one hand, if we take procurement, for example, if a government procures services, it's only paying for the services it buys. But if it hires people, Like if it beefs up the public service, you get not only the the personnel in the building, but you also get the associated liabilities that come with that. Is that why we're seeing that focus on the debate about the spending on, say, increasing the public, beefing up the public service, and reducing the reliance on consulting? Because you're, for want of a better term, Pradeep, the liability part of the government's balance sheet becomes slightly more obese.
Yes. Look, Tom, essentially this is a debate about whether there is sufficient capability and capacity in the public service to deliver the things that they say Australians need. Now, we used to have a very strong ideological debate between big government and small government. The truth is that in Australia, indeed in most of the developed world, political parties have kind of found a common ground in that they all tend to be quite interventionist. And so this gap between big government, small government has kind of become blurred and almost disappeared. You see this in US politics, you see this in Australia, you see this pretty much around developed democratic nations. Now, in Australia, there has been an argument that there has been some denuding of the capability in the public sector. Indeed, the government's acknowledged that. They've had some reviews into it, and they have the Australian Public Service Commissioner trying to rebuild capability and capacity. And there is a choice that then has to be made whether everything is done in-house, what do you outsource, what do you start to automate? Because technology is one of those really important things that can drive efficiency and effectiveness in government. But as we've also seen, Tom, and as you've reported on, you can also go horribly wrong. Because at the end of the day, you've got to understand government needs to keep the citizen and their needs at the center of what they do. And that's not always easy because it's hard to provide standardized public services to reduce your cost while providing a personalized service to the citizen. That's the challenge that governments make. And there are various ways they can think about it. But in the end, if we look at the years coming forward, Tom, it doesn't matter who's in government, they're going to face some serious spending pressures. One is because our population is aging, and that demographic change is going to have an impact on having a smaller proportion of the population who are going to work and pay tax, and a larger proportion of the population who are going to need services. That's one. But there are big spending pressures around defence and national security. We are entering into a world that is becoming more complex, more uncertain, and where national security is going to be a bigger and bigger feature. So that's one. Defence and national security pressures to spend are going to rise. The second is we have an energy transition that's underway, and both sides of politics now recognise the importance of it, but that's going to require more investment going forward. The third thing that's been topical in public political debate has been housing. There's going to be more pressure to spend money on housing. And finally, I go back to one of the economic things from this MAIFA is that investment is the Achilles heel of the economy. We've got to find new ways to incentivize investment and thus lift productivity going forward. So these spending pressures are going to loom large on whoever is in government. And the question is, how do you do this? And just always remember there are two sides to the ledger here, Tom. There's the spending side and there's the revenue side. And the reality is we need to embark on some reform on both sides. You got to think on the spending side, how do you pivot it much more towards incentivizing investment in the economy? That's one. The second is we have to do proper evaluations of what we're spending money on to make sure that it's effective and not wasteful. And on the other side of the ledger, we've got to the point where our revenue is not keeping up with expenditure, but more importantly, we have this over-reliance on personal income tax. And so we need economic reform around tax that starts to make a tax mix switch, i.e. switch the emphasis from personal income tax to broaden the base on other forms of income and wealth, and to think about what the new bases for economic activity will look like in the future that will require paying tax. So that's two sides of the ledger that you have to look at.
Interestingly, you mention in not so many words that great bogey of economic debate being tax reform. Both sides of politics, that is, the major parties, seem to struggle when it comes to having a genuine discussion about sort of putting our tax regime in, to coin a popular reference, going through an exercise of renovation rescue, right? And that is doing what needs to be done to change it, to improve things going forward. Why are we timid?
It's a really good question, Tom, and I think it's a complex kind of answer to that. One is, as a general rule, politics has become much more focused on the short term because the rewards are there in the short term. Okay. It appears, apparently, that the attention span of the electorate is more short term. The news heard changes so quickly through different mediums that the short term seems to dominate. And so it's no wonder that the political apparatus switches its focus towards the soundbite, the less discussion, less explanation, more short-term benefit. I think that's one. The second is we've allowed the loudest voices to always get their way. And the loudest voices aren't necessarily the ones we have to most listen to. Often it's the quiet voices, those who don't have a voice, who need the most help. And so you get this inequality in political economy that starts to develop, all focused on the short term. So what do we need to do? We need to have a more considered debate. We need to have institutions that allow for that considered debate. We need to make sure that we are conducting that debate far more respectfully than occurs at the moment. It is okay to have different points of view, but make sure people are sitting at the table. It's the number one rule in any negotiation, Tom. You can't negotiate an outcome unless there's a table and people are sitting at it. And so these are some of the things. There's some institutional factors that we need to tend to allow a better debate. Second, we've got to lift our horizons just from the short term. And third, we've got to conduct ourselves in a much more respectful manner than I think politics has allowed for and our institutions have allowed for in recent times.
Jargon, and you've been really generous with your time, but what I'd like to do is wrap up with this one, because economics is laden with jargon. And one of the ones that fascinates me, and always fascinates me, is the whole concept of something being off budget. Because, and I've had to get my head around this when I was a policy advisor many moons ago, looking at public sector accounting and private sector accounting, and sitting there thinking, oh, so the general government sector is a box with a bunch of things in it. And those things that are in the general government sector can invest in something that lives outside the general government sector. When in fact, if we think about it as a consolidated thing, it's all really, it's the same entity, right? Is are off-budget transactions, to coin a phrase, really the government playing with itself?
Look, these are legal arrangements that take place. And there is a time and a place for this. The problem is too many governments have seen these as a loophole, as a way of being able to go to people and say, we've got all this activity, but kick the can down the road in terms of the financial accountability. And what we're seeing is successive governments have loved setting up off-budget special purpose vehicles. Now, quite often there is some legitimacy where that vehicle has some asset against which there are borrowings made and things kind of look okay. But in the end, who foots the bill, Tom? It's taxpayers. And so
it doesn't quite, in a sense, what I was saying was right. It's at the end of the day, the owner,
yes,
ultimately is the community.
Absolutely. And look, you can set these special purpose vehicles up for a very good reason, because you can exert good management control over them in a way that is quite different to running a department. You can drive commerciality in a way that doesn't quite fit with a pure public service. But the budget transparency of this and the use of these vehicles has to be looked at, because what we've seen is that the gap between, say, the headline budget number and the underlying cash number is getting bigger and bigger. And it's all fine if these special purpose vehicles are governed well, they make a return, and at the end of the program, you close it off and there's no problem for the taxpayer. But the question is, if something goes wrong, the liability will then hit the books. And that's when taxpayers have to foot the bill. So increased transparency would be a great first step.
And how do you increase that? Well, what in basic terms, how do you make it? How do you illuminate that space?
So a couple of things. One is, let's start at the front end. Let's make it a lot harder to set up one of these off-budget vehicles in the first place. There's going to be a very, very good reason. The second is, in setting it up, let it not be hidden within hundreds of pages of budget documents as to what's expected, how it's going to work, what the rate of return is, what the risks are. Let's be upfront about that. And then the third thing is, make sure the reporting on how they're actually going is really clear in terms of the budget. I think it's really important, given that at the end of the day, the budget numbers around cash and headline flow into what you have to fund. And so it's important from a funding perspective and therefore a tax perspective that we have clarity on this.
Pradeep, that's been a really neat deep dive, almost half an hour on what is a very, very complicated area, very complicated terrain. Thank you so much for walking us through this.
Thanks very much, Tom. Take care.
And thank you for joining me for this episode of Ravlic at Large. I will be back soon with another episode shortly. But in the meantime, stay safe, take care of each other, and I'll be back soon.